Francis Lee and Stephen Macedo, welcome to the podcast.
Nice to be with you.
Thank you, Yascha.
So you have written a book that looks in quite thorough empirical detail at our response to the COVID pandemic. Take us back, if you will, to 2019. At that point, if somebody had said, we are about, somewhat unsurprisingly, because we've been worried about this for a long time, to have a big global pandemic of a respiratory virus, what was the playbook supposed to be? What was the response that the CDC and other institutions had planned for years and decades supposed to look like?
Well, maybe I could take a whack at it first, and then Francis can take it over. They would have found that there were decades of pre-COVID pandemic plans in 2019. In fact, they would have found a fresh one from Johns Hopkins University over the summer of 2019, surveying and asking questions about the whole range of non-pharmaceutical interventions that were considered a few months later, and finding that that account found that there was very weak evidence to support the effectiveness of all of these non-pharmaceutical measures that would soon become familiar, including contact tracing, masking, social distancing measures of various sorts, school closures, business closures, and so on. And indeed, if they had waited a few months, they would have found that in November of 2019, the World Health Organization would have issued yet another planning document surveying these non-pharmaceutical interventions in much the same way. And they would have found there, too, that the World Health Organization found that the evidence to support the effectiveness of all of these measures was quite weak. And in fact, they would have read that the World Health Organization said that there were some things that were not recommended under any circumstances, including contact tracing, border closures, quarantine of exposed individuals. They would also have found emphatic statements that these measures would be costly, that they would impose costs, especially on children, in light of school closures, and the less well-off. And if they had looked further back, they would have found debates under the George W. Bush administration with some mathematical modelers who were more optimistic about these measures, who, based on their models, which involved a lot of speculation about behavioral changes, they would have found that these modelers were much more hopeful about targeted, layered interventions of various sorts. If we could just pile them all on top of each other, then maybe they would work. But they would have found in National Institutes of Medicine a letter reporting on the empirical evidence behind those optimistic accounts, warning that the evidence for these measures was not good, the costs would be high, and finally that political leaders would be tempted to implement these measures regardless, in order to show that in a crisis they were in charge and that they had things under control. So they really would have found quite a comprehensive assessment of both the effectiveness of these measures, their costs, and the risks that there would be political temptations to engage in these tough measures to show that political leaders were in charge. So an absence of evidence, an absence of good evidence for the effectiveness of measures that would soon be implemented on a large scale.
So why is it that all went out of the window so quickly, right? If there was a playbook that had been researched and debated and prepared for such a long time, you then have obviously this very scary situation where this virus is actually starting to spread, and you do see emergency rooms being overloaded in northern Italy, in New York, and so on. It's understandable that this is a very scary situation for policymakers to try and orient through. You're in the fog of pandemic war. But why is it that all of that preparation seemingly gets ignored at that point, and all of the measures that these plans said would not be effective become the kind of conventional wisdom, really in a period of a few weeks?
I'd say there's two critical factors that induced that shift towards much greater optimism about the effectiveness of non-pharmaceutical interventions. First was the lockdown in Wuhan, and the immediate fall in cases and deaths from the disease after the lockdown had been implemented. There was a World Health Organization delegation that was sent to Wuhan. It was about a week. There were a couple of Americans on it. And the report comes back, the report that's produced out of that trip endorses the Chinese approach fulsomely and recommends it to the whole world. There isn't any skepticism raised about the effectiveness of the measures in that report. That it's sort of strange to go back and look at it now, having gone through the pandemic, that at no point does the report address how we already knew that pandemics come in waves, and that one would have expected there to have been a decline. That's just how the pandemics unfold, and every place has experienced multiple waves of COVID. But at any rate, it was seemed to have been effective. Second then was the lockdown in Italy, the first nationwide lockdown, which then sort of set an example for other democracies. The measures were popular. There was a clamor for the imposition of these measures. When they were imposed in the U.S. in mid-March, 87% of Americans supported them, including large majorities of both parties. And then, so in addition to those developments cascading from the Wuhan example, there is another important report produced by Imperial College London by Neil M. Ferguson, who had been a longtime collaborator of the mathematical modelers that Steve mentioned, dating back to the George W. Bush years. So in other words, one of those voices that had long been optimistic about the use of non-pharmaceutical interventions. And that report laid out very clearly for policymakers that this was going to be a devastating disease. In fact, it projected that that in the U.S. there would be 2.2 million COVID deaths by August of 2020, and then also provided differing projections if social distancing measures were implemented, so that if there were measures, so-called social distancing of the whole population, that we could expect to significantly reduce those tallies. And so I think laying that out for policymakers in a stark way made it very difficult for them to resist the push for broad-ranging closures.
Well, one of the very interesting things that happened in the space of a few short weeks in 2020 is that the meaning of these NPIs, these non-pharmaceutical interventions, and in particular of social distancing, changed in two ways very quickly, I think. So the first is, I wrote an article called Cancel Everything for The Atlantic on March 6, 2020, which went kind of hyper-viral, and I think had some actual impact. When I was publishing that article, there were still giant indoor concerts planned for the next weekend, right? There was still sporting events, indoors and outdoors, going ahead. The Biden campaign was still planning giant rallies for the following days. And so when I said cancel everything, that's not the title that I chose, that's what my editors put, but when I wrote this article, what I was trying to say is, let's avoid having these events which, have value, but which are not fundamentally important, while we figure out what's going on with this virus and what's going on with this pandemic, right? We shouldn't be creating these potential mass spreading events just in order to have a campaign rally, right? The other thing is that the slogan of those times was flatten the curve, right? We were seeing that health systems had become overwhelmed in Wuhan, that they were being overwhelmed in northern Italy. And I have a good friend who's an emergency room doctor in Italy who was in touch with a lot of his colleagues at those hospitals, so I had a kind of direct sense of that, right? And the idea was, the goal here is simply to make sure that we don't have such a surge in cases so early on that people who could easily be treated with relatively straightforward medical interventions are going to die because no doctor is able to go see them because the ICU is so overloaded. Now, very quickly, the idea of let's not have mass concerts indoors turned into let's close down schools and let's have government regulations tell people you're not allowed to leave your house unless you have an excuse and so on and so forth. And the idea of flatten the curve turned into make people stay at home indefinitely. So that to me is a really striking development that happened, within a span of a few weeks in March 2020. How did that come about?
Well, one thing I would say on that is that the recommendations not to hold large-scale events, sounds more like the policies used in Sweden. That basically the canceling of large-scale events, but keeping schools open, sort of trying to find a balance with the aim of flattening the curve, as you described. That was more consistent with the pre-COVID pandemic planning, and so but of course that was quickly treated as a departure from the rest of the world. That Sweden was taking the experimental approach was how it was covered, when it was really the rest of the world that was adopting completely new approaches, really inspired by the extraordinarily stringent lockdowns that had been employed in Wuhan and in Italy.
The message became quite quickly over the summer that we could only reopen safely when there's sufficient contact tracing on a massive scale that we didn't have the capacity for, so that virus spread could be reduced to a few hotspots that could be detected somehow and then suppressed. So, as Francis said, we seem to move from this mitigation strategy aimed at flattening the curve to a kind of suppression strategy aimed at reopening only once it was safe, and keeping mandatory measures in place until that time.
It's also worth noting on that contact tracing point, that was one of the measures not recommended under any circumstances for a respiratory pandemic, because it was understood that contact tracing could not be implemented at the speed necessary to successfully wrestle this type of virus to the ground. It spreads too quickly. And contact tracing cannot catch up, never did. Contact tracers, even when states hired thousands of them, were overwhelmed by the efforts. So that was understood not to be a fruitful way to approach a pandemic of this kind, and it was never attempted in Sweden. So it's quite interesting how this also became universally embraced among policy leaders in the U.S. Without confronting the reasons why previous pandemic planners had rejected this approach for a respiratory pandemic.
I think it's also worth pointing out that in March 2020, so shortly after the time you mentioned, Yascha, when people did start closing down, and after China had done so, there was a lot of pushback initially for a brief period of time in op-eds in major newspapers, the New York Times, the Washington Post, from a variety of very well-known public health officials. David Katz at Yale, Justin Lesler at Johns Hopkins, Tom Frieden, former CDC director, and Michael Osterholm at the University of Minnesota, widely regarded as a terrific expert on these matters, said things like the Chinese must not be getting very good advice. This is not something that has ever been successful before. Anthony Fauci said that. Michael Osterholm made the point in a couple of different op-eds that the virus is spreading in society, and there was very little that could be done to stop it. That the best strategy would probably be focusing protection on the vulnerable, and allowing most people to go about their business, more or less as normal with some voluntary measures in place, and those who were relatively healthy, who had low risk, would thereby contribute to herd immunity by this happening while we protected the vulnerable. So there was some real realism in the middle of March, maybe towards the end of March, in a number of places, and a kind of acceptance that the virus that was already spreading could not be slowed. But then that seemed to disappear by April and May heading into the summer, and we no longer heard that kind of dissent being welcomed.
Yeah, one of the interesting things that I think it's easy to forget in retrospect is how quickly the debate oscillated in the early days of a pandemic and how quickly the political fronts were changing. I mean, you go back to January and February of 2020, and the people who are warning about the pandemic, the people who are worried about it, tend to be more on the political right. Tom Cotton is going on quite early on about the threat of the virus, and it tends to be Democrats who are assuaging. I think Nancy Pelosi in Chinatown in San Francisco towards the end of February 2020 basically says, if you're worried about this pandemic, you're really subject to misinformation, and it might be motivated by irrational fear of Chinese people, etc. You really shouldn't worry about it. And then, of course, later in the pandemic, when Donald Trump starts to worry about the damage it might do to the American economy and perhaps in part his chances of re-election, it becomes the left that is saying, no, we are the party that really wants to continue to social distance and lock down and so on and so forth. The same is obviously true of masks. We now remember masks as being kind of a cause célèbre of the political left and of Anthony Fauci, and it's the right that is anti-maskers that are not believing the public health guidance, etc. But you go back to February and early March of 2020, and those political fronts are less clear. And it's Fauci who is saying, look, these masks work for trained professionals in hospitals, for doctors and nurses. They really don't work for anybody else. In part because at that time personal protective equipment is so scarce that many doctors and nurses don't get access to it. And however you feel about what I believe was a kind of semi-noble denial, as they thought of it, they seem to have thought the only way we can make sure that these doctors and nurses have access to this PPE is to discourage the general public from trying to buy up these stocks. And so we're really going to lean into the evidence that masks don't work. Now, there's an additional irony here, which is that sort of, early on they say that the masks don't work in what seems to me like a political communications exercise. Then it becomes a very polarized issue where part of being a good person who believes in the institutions and who believes in public health, and certainly in more left-leaning milieus, is to very, very thoroughly wear masks, and I did that for much of a pandemic. But in retrospect, it's not clear that masks worked in the first place. So tell us a little bit about that debate.
Let me just say that, in addition to what you just said, Dr. Fauci was asked in 2019 by an interviewer, what should we do in the event of another pandemic? This is with no sense of COVID on the horizon. And the interviewer said, should I wear a mask? Should I? And Dr. Fauci immediately interrupts and said, no. Avoid the paranoid stuff. Just get a good night's sleep. Don't drink too much. Get some exercise. Do the normal healthy things. So he was, before COVID, he was not confident about masks working. And indeed, that would be entirely consistent with those pre-COVID pandemic plans that we talked about before. More recently, just even a few weeks ago, he was...
Just to pick you up on that point, so there's been a good bit of debate about that, and I'm not quite sure what to think. So, when Fauci says in February of 2020, I believe it's in February of 2020, don't go out and buy masks. They're not going to help you. Do you believe, and there's some debate about whether or not he was misleading the public, for the understandable purpose of trying to make sure that doctors and nurses would have access to those masks who needed them in the hospital. Do you believe that he was truthfully stating his opinion at the time, or do you think he was to some extent knowingly misleading the public?
We don't really know what was in his mind. The fact is that was correct, and it was consistent with the studies of masks, the Cochrane reports that had been done before, that masking was not effective at controlling respiratory viruses. And when he has reflected on this more recently, just in the last few months, when asked whether masks worked, he said, yes, of course masks work. But then he said if we wore an N95 mask, these very tightly fitting respirators that medical professionals might wear, very tightly fitted, breathe through only the N95, and did so very, very conscientiously, then that would work. But that wasn't what was being recommended when cloth masks and other sorts of things were being recommended in 2020. So I don't know what he had in mind, or when he was being sincere and when not. There was a lot of incredible flip-flopping around mask wearing. Andy Slavin, in his book, reflecting back on the pandemic, says early on that he was told by Michael Osterholm that masks would not be effective, and he's reposed great trust in Michael Osterholm. And then 70 pages later in the book, he's lamenting that some people are not wearing masks to control the pandemic. So in that case, I think he just sort of forgot from 70 pages earlier what he had been told. So there was certainly a lot of inconsistency around this.
Francis, you want to comment on this?
Yeah. I'll just say that when Dr. Fauci did not recommend masks in February of 2020, what he was saying was consistent with the pre-pandemic plans, that they were skeptical of masks. They often never even mentioned masks. The U.S. plan didn't mention masks, for example. Others would mention it and say, well, it's bioplausible, but we lack evidence. And there had been studies, as Steve mentioned, by the Cochrane Library, which is a highly regarded institution that takes stock of scientific evidence in many, with regard to many medical interventions. So I think what Dr. Fauci was saying in February was more or less this conventional wisdom. I also don't think that the noble lie explanation works very well, because cloth masks were what the CDC recommended on April the 3rd, and has always been what CDC has recommended subsequently. So cloth masks, there was never a shortage of those for purposes of instructing people on how to protect the community or themselves. So I think it was a desire to give people something that would reassure them, and they thought, well, maybe it'll help. But there just wasn't an evidence base that they could rest such recommendations on, much less mandates.
And that's an interesting aspect of all of this, thinking about it in a more sociological, perhaps even anthropological vein, that it feels like all of the deeply charged, emotionally charged debates we ended up having over how to behave during the pandemic perhaps had the function of making us feel like we're in control, right? I mean, the kind of incandescent anger at somebody who had what was called a neck beard, right? Who was wearing the mask because in many places there was regulations that you had to wear the mask, you might get fined, but who basically just like had it hang down below the nose and mouth where it didn't really achieve anything. And the kind of anger at that, I think, was perhaps in part, in retrospect, the desire to feel like if I do the right thing, I'm going to get through the scary period, right? It was actually a kind of misdirected form of self-reassurance.
And virtue signaling, I mean, to others that you care. I think when you say virtue signaling, that there's other regarding, that you would also prevent other people from contracting whatever you might have. So I do think it became a symbol of concern about others. And once Donald Trump stopped wearing them properly, took it off on the balcony of the White House, famously, it then became a partisan symbol as well. And as Francis said, in those reports, it does describe some of these measures as mechanistically plausible. So, people thinking about droplets and so on. But for an aerosolized virus, there was no evidence of effectiveness, and that had been long-standing. But nevertheless, it did become a very powerful symbol, and I think what you're saying is correct.
It's one of the unfortunate aspects of the pandemic response, is the way in which these recommendations drove deep divides into society, dividing friends from friends and family members from other family members around measures that there was never a good evidence base on which they should have been recommended so strongly or mandated. The same thing, of course, proved to be the case with the vaccine mandates, where going out and telling people in the summer of 2021 that if you get this vaccine, you'll become a dead end to the virus, that you can protect your loved ones if you get this vaccine. And then everybody discovering in short order that it didn't stop you from catching COVID and from transmitting COVID. The CDC even did a report in late summer 2021 after an outbreak in Provincetown, documenting that vaccinated people were spreading the virus and contracting it. And yet they still went forward with those vaccine mandates in the Biden administration. And this was also very divisive among people in society. And we already suffered from deep polarization. And then just to layer on additional divides without a good evidence base. I mean, this is an unfortunate feature of how the pandemic unfolded. I don't think it was an intentional set of actions that leaders took, but nevertheless, it shows that taking measures that you sort of hope will help but don't have a strong evidence base for believing that it will help, that can be reckless. You can wind up doing more harm to society than good.
It's interesting how many different controversial elements there are of this broader controversial topic of a pandemic. And we've talked a little bit about social distancing, we've talked a little bit about masks. You're now bringing up a third big topic, vaccines, and there's obviously others we'll get to, including school closures, perhaps the origin of the virus, and so on. When it comes to vaccines, it seems to me both that is the one area in which the technocracy, the experts, the science triumphed, right? Because we did manage to get these incredible vaccines which significantly reduce the risk of having adverse consequences from COVID for people, particularly those who are more vulnerable, particularly those who are older and so on. And in a way, we managed to get out of this pandemic much faster than we would otherwise have done because they became widely available and widely distributed so quickly. So this is the one point in which we might say actually humanity triumphed. But as you're pointing out, vaccines also then became this hyper-polarized political issue, in part because if these vaccines had, as initially advertised, stopped your vulnerability to the virus, but also stopped transmission to the virus, the politics of that would have been very different. But what turned out to be the case is that it gave you quite good protection against adverse consequences for yourself, but not so good protection against transmitting it to others. And that meant two things, right? That meant, first of all, that normatively, the justification for requiring people to get vaccinated was much less obvious, was much lower, right? If it were true that me getting this vaccine would stop other vulnerable people in the community from likely contracting COVID, the case for requiring me to do so would have been stronger. Perhaps it would not have been strong enough to allow the state to impose that kind of treatment on people. We can have a debate about that, but it would certainly have been much more plausible than it was. And then the second is that it sort of turned this into a classic question of liberal political theory about the nanny state, right? If what's involved really is reducing your likelihood of adverse consequences for you, do we have the right to make you do this? And the classical answer from John Stuart Mill on down would be, of course not. But the answer that governments took, and particularly the then left-leaning government in the United States under Joe Biden, was yes, we are going to do that. So how should we think about this, both in terms of our willingness to recognize this empirical fact that this life-saving vaccine does not in fact stop transmission, even though that was originally advertised, but also that normative debate that was kind of implicit in this grappling with how to deal with a vaccine that has those particular properties it turned out to have.
Well, let's just say a couple of things about that. I mean, I basically agree with everything you just said. I mean, the self-regarding point is not quite as simple. We require people to wear motorcycle helmets in many states in the United States, and the main concern there is people injuring themselves, but also society bears a cost from the medical expenses and so on, because we're not going to allow people just to bleed in the street. So it's not entirely self-regarding, even as far as that goes. But I think you're right. I mean, there was a lot of. I mean, the vaccines were a game changer. We agree with that. They were very important, especially for the vulnerable parts of the population. I mean, there was some misleading messaging around vaccination and natural immunity. There was not full transparency about the of side effects, which were real for some small number of people, and there should have been more openness about that. The other thing is that later on, recommendations on boosters in the United States have gone far beyond those in Europe. I mean, we've been recommending boosters here for people over the age of 6 months, when in Europe they were being recommended for people over the age of 65, and the evidence base for that, those very extreme, so by global standards, recommendations is not well established. And the other thing around this that's related is that prior to the vaccines, the World Health Organization and other agencies were denying the reality of natural immunity from getting the virus and recovering. The World Health Organization actually changed the definition of herd immunity on its website over the summer of 2020. It had said, what was common sense among epidemiologists, that herd immunity can come from people getting the virus and recovering, or from being vaccinated. They changed it over the summer of 2020 to say it just comes from vaccination. And of course, they were called out on that, and then they changed it back. There were problematic aspects too, and whether when there were vaccine requirements, which may not have been well justified, as you suggested, should having had the virus have counted. Now, that may be a little harder to verify, but there should not have been this misleading messaging. I think with the World Health Organization and other agencies, they were trying to encourage people to not get the virus, to wait for the vaccine, arguably absolutely the right thing to do, but they shouldn't have misled people about it. And as you say, this was another perhaps noble lie, but in any case, people have felt misled about various aspects of this. But we're not vaccine skeptics, and Francis's chapters show that the vaccine made a big difference.
I'll just speak on the vaccine making a big difference. That there's a strong relationship between vaccine uptake across the states and mortality from COVID in the post-vaccine period. So that at the end of the pandemic, at least in January 2023, which is when our data leave off, there's a marked difference between Democratic and Republican leaning states in terms of their overall COVID mortality. That Republican states, which had lower vaccine uptake, do worse. It's about in fact, Democratic states wind up doing quite markedly better by the end of the time series. But all of that difference between Republican and Democratic leaning states emerges in the post-vaccine period. That if we just look at the period before the vaccines rolled out, at the initial vaccines being administered to nursing home residents, that got underway December 24th, 2020. So prior to that, there was a lot of variation in how the different states in the U.S. approached the pandemic. And yet, at the end of that time period, there's not a notable difference between Republican and Democratic leaning states in COVID mortality per capita.
So the anti-vaccine rhetoric really does seem to have had a very, very adverse consequence.
In the Republican states, yes. Yes, lower vaccine uptake, higher mortality once vaccines are available.
Tell me about the debate over one particular element of social distancing policies, which probably had one of the most lasting socioeconomic impacts, which is school closures. How was the decision taken originally to close down schools? Was the intention originally to keep them closed for a long time, or was it similar to this logic of flattening the curve, that we're going to do this for a few weeks to figure out what's going on, then we're going to reopen? And why is it that in some parts of the United States in particular, schools ended up being closed down for such a long period of time, which again was quite abnormal in an international perspective?
It's one of the ironies of the pandemic that schools were the first to close and the last to reopen of our major social institutions. The school closures got started even before the coronavirus task force recommended closures. On March the 16th was the press conference where governors were instructed to close schools and other businesses where people congregate, both indoors and outdoors. That recommendation, so that begins March the 16th. And many governors do act to close schools after that. But schools had already started closing before that, beginning on March the 5th. And then so there's a cascade already underway. Now, as for those of us who had any association with universities or our educational institutions during that time, you know that initially it was that we were told that this was a short-term closure. This would be a couple of weeks, and then we would come back. And so those initial closures of schools were also announced on that kind of basis. And it was only later on in the spring when governors then announced that schools would not be reopening at all in the 2019-2020 school year. There were just a couple of states where some schools reopened. Wyoming and Montana saw some schools reopen in spring of 2020. But aside from that, all the public schools stayed closed, serving 50 million young people. Through the entirety of the balance of that the 2019-2020 school year. Now, schools began to reopen in large swaths of the U.S. in fall of 2020. So across the South, across the Intermountain West, and in the Plains. As we look at it in the book, the best predictor of whether schools would stay closed or reopen is the partisan lean of the jurisdiction. This is true at the state level. It's also true if you look down. Other scholars have done this work looking down at the school district level. That the partisanship was exercises a profound effect, and it's more important than anything else. It's more important than any epidemiological facts about what's happening in any particular location, and it's more important than teacher union strength, though of course that interest-group politics also plays a role. But it's primarily a story of partisanship. Half of public schools in the U.S. would still be closed in March of 2021, and in the bluest jurisdictions, schools would not reopen in the 2020-2021 school year. So that in many cases you're looking at schools not reopening until the fall of 21. So this was extraordinary and much longer than other advanced democracies. The length of the U.S. school closures looks more like the developing world and looks more like Latin America than it does to our European peers.
And what's the evidence both about how rational that was at the time and what kind of impact that had in the long run? So, to play devil's advocate for a moment, I can understand why people might say, look, the most important thing is to protect young children. The worst thing that could happen is that a lot of young people die because of the pandemic. And of course, at least very early on, it was hard to know exactly how differential the impact of COVID might be on different age groups. Now, my understanding is also that, older people weren't just at greater risk of dying from this virus, which was not true of all viruses. We go back to the Spanish influenza epidemic in 1918, 1919. It was actually young adults who were particularly strongly affected. So we got very lucky in that respect in the COVID pandemic. But it's not just that older people are more affected, it's that they are, orders of magnitude more affected than young people, and that really there was very, very few deaths among young people, particularly those without very serious pre-existing conditions. But sort of, at what point could we confidently say this? So are these mistakes that are obvious with the benefit of hindsight, or should they have been obvious at the time? And secondly, what's your best estimate as to how much long-term learning loss and other kind of adverse social impacts those school closures had? Was there a very high price to be paid for that in a more permanent way, or is that going to be made up in the years of in-person schooling that those kids are hopefully experiencing now?
Let me just say, on the age gradient on the disease, that was known very early. I mean, late January it was known, because it was clear who was dying in Wuhan, and then it was clear who was dying in Italy. So there were already good indications that young people were not showing up at hospitals with severe outcomes relating to COVID. So that information was there. Sweden did not close schools at all, and so by depending on how long a time frame you want to see evidence, but by surely by late spring could take stock. And in fact, there was a publication out of Swedish with Swedish data pointing out that Swedish kids in open schools, and these are open schools still open at full capacity with no social distancing, no masking, that they had not had worse outcomes from compared to young people in places where schools were closed, and teachers had not suffered worse outcomes than other professionals, and so they had that evidence. Then the EU schools began to open in summer of 2020, and EU ministers had a couple of meetings in the summer of 2020. This is detailed in David Zweig's new book called Abundance of Caution on the politics of, and policy making around school closures in the U.S. And at both of those meetings, it was announced that where schools had reopened, there was no evidence of increased community spread. So no evidence that young people were suffering, no evidence that teachers were suffering worse outcomes where schools were open. And yet even it still was impossible to get schools in so many places in the U.S. opened in the fall of 2020, despite all this evidence available from other places. So one of the most striking features of pandemic policymaking is how these fixed ideas that got set around the narrative in early spring 2020 just were not revisited as new information came in. I don't know if Steve, you have anything you want to add on this?
No, I agree with all of that. We know too that of course in those mathematical models that were optimistic about these various closure measures, non-pharmaceutical interventions, they did see school closures as the crucial thing because children couldn't be kept apart. I don't think that was all that important once COVID got started, but school closures are regarded as the crucial measure in the pre-COVID modeling exercises that did play a role very early on in COVID. But I think there was ample evidence. Emily Oster, I think, did a study of daycare centers, some of which were closed, some of which were open over the summer. The government wasn't gathering information on these places, looking at the differences in transmission between places that were open, daycare centers, and those that were closed. But she did some calling around and so on and found no differences in rates of disease across those who were working from home versus those who were working in person in daycare centers. So there was a real failure to learn from evidence that was being gathered, and even in when the Republican states had largely opened their schools, still over the course of the fall and into the spring, there wasn't an uptake somehow in Democratic states. In some cases, there were. The governor of Massachusetts at least allowed local schools to make their own decisions on these matters. That provided some grounds for comparison too. And Catholic schools were open in many places and so on. There would have been ample evidence, certainly, by late fall, going into the spring, and yet there was great resistance to learning about these matters.
And it's interesting, governments were not collecting data. Governments, we had to rely on the private firms' data on which schools were closed and open. Those data were not being collected. And you've got independent researchers like Emily Oster going out and collecting data. It should have been a top priority of CDC and NIH to begin to work on compiling a superior database sets of data on which decisions could have been made, and yet they just didn't do it. There was again just no interest in learning, as best we can tell. No systematic effort, no institutionalized effort to learn.
And I think that comes from a kind of sanctification of particular policies, right? This is the right policy that somebody moral must want, and therefore there's no trade-off involved here. And one of the things I was really struck by in those debates about school closures was not just that we didn't systematically collect evidence about whether they had, a positive effect on public health in the United States, whether opening schools really did lead to community spread and other, negative things, but also that there was a denial of the idea that they might have genuine costs. I remember a number of really striking op-eds published in the time in, mainstream publications, which said things like, actually, this is going to be positive for children because rather than having this boring school learning, they're going to be learning from their families in these other important social ways. And actually, it's going to lead to superior development. Often talking about families where the parents actually did have to go to work, who might have had manual work that was not cancelled by the virus. They weren't working from home and could pretend to call into the office while actually playing with the kids. They may have had real emergencies in terms of how to provide safe childcare while they had to go and earn a living that would allow them to pay rent. So just on this point, what do we now know about sort of the extent of learning loss for children that were kept out of school? And do we have a decent estimate at this point about whether they might be able to make that up in the rest of their schooling, or is this just going to lead to many individuals having a permanently lower skill set, being less good at reading and writing and doing math than they might have been if we hadn't pursued those policies?
Well, if we draw on the best data that we have on student performance, that's the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the NAEP We see that the pandemic caused the school shutdowns. The pandemics are associated with the largest drops we'd ever seen by that indicator in both reading and math. And there hasn't been significant recovery since. The closing schools had other effects in addition to the cost associated with just keeping schools closed. That it also broke the habits of school attendance for young people. And so you saw a rough doubling of chronic absenteeism in school attendance all around the country. That's nationally. And so it's very hard for students to make up lost time when in fact they're missing more school than they used to miss. The closures were inequitably distributed, that urban schools were closed longer, schools in high poverty districts were closed longer, and the effects were worse, as you might expect, because it amplified inequalities that already existed in society, that these were also not parents who were in a position to be able to spend the day working with their kids to teach them reading and math. And so students who were academically lagging fell farther behind. So it's not just a uniform drop, though there was a uniform drop, but it was bigger than that. So, in some for some than others. So every place went down, but some places went down more than others. And as it did so, the effects tended to widen pre-existing inequality. Students who were lagging academically suffered more. So bigger losses among those who were already behind. So it's and as I said, that we don't have evidence that things are improving. So the effects are long lasting. They even were evident among young people who were just entering school at the end of the pandemic. That because of their lack of socialization, time with other kids in the years leading up to school, were less prepared, less school ready, less able to deal with other kids, less able to hold a pencil and do the sorts of things that you sort of expect a kindergartner should be able to do. So there was a long tail on these effects.
And they were perfectly predictable. There's evidence from teacher strikes that was available at the beginning of COVID, indicating that these costs would be there, and other measures. So Paul Peterson wrote about this in Education Next. All of these, those matters should have been well known.
Just stepping back for a moment, I have a question about how all of this played out politically, right? It's obvious that we had this very far extent of polarization in the United States, in which, a few months into the pandemic, your ideological leaning predicted how you felt about many of those policies, and the partisan identity of a state governor predicted to some significant extent, how severe the lockdowns they ordered would be, how long they would last. As you were saying, the partisan lean of school districts helped to predict whether those schools would stay closed or not. Is that partisan lean the same in the United States as it is in other places, and is there an obvious logic rooted in political theory or political psychology in that? I'm struck by the fact that when I read one of my favorite books in political psychology, The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt, John argues that conservatives play on a broad set of moral emotions. Liberals often focus in particular on two, which is fairness and equality. And that therefore they underplay things like purity and the fear of contagion and so on, which conservatives also are able to exploit for their political purposes. Now, if you took that logic seriously and you think about it in 2019, you might think, well, who's going to jump at a pandemic as the dangerous virus that's going to enter our community and spoil our purity and spread this contagion? It should be conservatives who would be particularly reactive to a global pandemic, who would say, do anything to defeat this threat to our security, to our safety. But that's not at all how it played out. So is this all contingent? Does it just have to do with who's in power and what decisions particular newspaper editors made at a particular time? Or is there more sort of fundamental set of political attributes about this period, which, if you run the pandemic 1,000 times, 999 times, you're going to get the left wanting longer school closures and more extreme social distancing, and the right saying, no, do away with all of those measures.
It is clear, I think, that the United States was more polarized on these issues than Europe. Mark Woolhouse, a Scottish epidemiologist, has a very good book called The Year the World Went Mad, and he makes it clear, I think, that there was more learning over the summer of 2020 in the UK, and of course European schools generally reopened in the fall. So that was not as polarized, I think. I think in 2020, Donald Trump's presence on the ballot and it being an election year made a big difference. He was probably on his way to being reelected had it not been for the pandemic. He wanted, at a certain point at least, he made noises about wanting the economy to be reopened and so on. And I think that there was a strong polarization effect of the scientific establishment being seemed to be much more cautious on these matters of reopening and much more concerned about preventing the spread of disease. Anthony Fauci became a symbol for that, and others. And so I do think Trump contributed to the polarization there, and it was a very strong sort of partisan effect there. And so I think that made things worse. I'm not sure what I think about this reflecting deeper aspects of liberalism or conservatism. Francis, what do you think?
I'm skeptical that we can trace this down to differing psychology of Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals. Though I did note and did give some thought to how the partisanship seemed to be reversed based on what one would have expected, given conservatives' greater concern psychologically, or what's been documented as a greater psychological focus on purity. And on avoiding disease. So to the extent that there are those differences, they're not huge. That doesn't seem to be determinative of the response. I really do think it is highly contingent and grew out of a reaction to a president that Democrats did not trust. That he on a daily basis would go out and give press conferences. Everything about the response to the pandemic became associated with him. It was seen through that lens. And of course, Democrats are looking to mount a case for turning him out of office in November of 2020. And so they are going to want to say that he's not doing a good job. And so they lay at his feet every COVID death as if it could have been stopped. That was the rhetoric, and you had the Biden campaign pointing to closed schools as a reason why Trump should not be reelected. So there was opportunistic use of the pandemic for purposes of developing a rationale for not reelecting Trump. So that's part of the politicization. But you could also say it fits in with certain predispositions among progressives that the pandemic is a societal problem, and if we all pull together and act collectively, we can solve this problem together. That's a line of thinking or an approach to social problems that is more recognizably progressive, and so I think it sort of fit in intellectually with the way progressives think about how social problems can be solved.
I think that's a good point there. That we do find that in April 2020, fairly soon in the pandemic, a wartime rhetoric develops around war on COVID, and there's a call for national unity, and universities and independent foundations and government and the media all pulling together and being on the same page. Now, again, you wouldn't necessarily associate, at least in the past, we wouldn't have associated liberalism with this sense of needing national unity and, in a way, implicitly, I think, not being welcome to dissent and debate. But that did manifest itself in April and subsequently. So however one regards this as from the standpoint of political psychology or political philosophy, the partisan nature of it led those on the left to double down on strategies that were seen to be the opposite of what Trump said. Same thing happened with the origins of the virus. Once he said, it probably leaked from a lab and came from China, everybody, many people took the opposite point of view and have kind of stuck with it in the face of competing evidence to the contrary.
This is one other way of thinking about it, I suppose, which is that a fundamental fact about America in 2019 was that the left had started to have much more trust in institutions and experts in science and public health authorities than the right, which is itself a kind of interesting deviation from what you might have said about American politics in 1960 or something like that, but was clearly well established before the pandemic, then accelerated by the pandemic. And so, one element of this is, well, why is it that those public health authorities, which the left trusted to a higher degree than the right, made the decisions they did, which is then a kind of slightly separate question, right? And as to that, one of the things that's just really striking in retrospect, and that's striking in how you describe it, is just the amount of groupthink that you get very, very quickly in those institutions, where topics that are subject of genuine debate, including the social distancing measures, on March 1st, 2020, become barely questioned anymore by May 1st, 2020, where, an open question about the origin of the virus in January 2020 becomes, not because there's very strong scientific evidence to rule out an alternative hypothesis, by consensus, obviously a natural origin rather than a virus that was created by gain-of-function research and then most likely through some kind of accident escaped the lab. Why is it that institutions that are meant to have mechanisms for internal debate, that are meant to operate on the principles of academic freedom in some cases, that are meant to actually follow scientific procedures which kick the tires of any empirical claim to see whether there might not be an alternative explanation, sort of fail, throughout the pandemic in this remarkable way?
I mean, the why question is hard, but your description, I think, is correct. A consensus developed, and I think you're right. Part of it was that the Democratic Party has become more associated with being the party of educated elites. Percentage of Democrats with a four-year college degree has increased considerably in the last 25 years, where Republicans have tended to remain about the same at about 30% with a four-year college degree. Democrats have more than doubled over the same 30-year period. So I think that is part of it. But why there shouldn't have been, again, with respect to the COVID pandemic plans and masks and so on, the sense was, I think, in part that these things are only going to work unless everyone complies, and we need compliance for the sake of the social good. On other matters like the origins of the virus, why that should have been turned into a partisan issue is harder to see, except that the scientific establishment took the position early on that the virus had a natural origin. We now have lots of information about how that consensus came about, but the scientific establishment took that position, whereas Trump and others have suggested that the virus may well have originated in the Chinese virus lab that studies these viruses and that experiments in making them more dangerous. Exactly why that has not, there hasn't been more open debate about this. Some of these matters, even now, is puzzling. I think one of the things we found is that public health seems to be a very hierarchical discipline. There's a single funding source, the National Institutes of Health, which is hugely important for people working in this area. And there seems to be a reluctance, I think, as compared with political science, to question and challenge others, even on matters where it seems as though mistakes have been made and maybe in some cases even that the truth isn't being told about certain matters. So we have found that this is as a hierarchical discipline. Actually, the former dean of the Boston University School of Public Health, Sandro Galea, wrote a book himself along these lines called Towards a More Liberal Public Health. And it's his memoir and part of the COVID years, again suggesting, just as you've said, that his own field is subject to unfortunate degrees of groupthink and intolerance of dissent. He's just gone on to found another school of public health at Washington University in St. Louis. So this is concerning. And with respect to the issue of the suppression of speech on social media, that we now know that the Biden administration contacted social media companies secretly and asked them to deboost messages at odds with administration policy and to change the algorithm so that it would boost messaging supporting government policy. We don't know of a single law school conference that's taken place on these matters. The Supreme Court decided that the plaintiffs didn't have jurisdiction, so they never got to the merits of the issue after federal appeals court and district court found that these measures violated the First Amendment. But this certainly matters a First Amendment concern. And it's very surprising to us that in the academy broadly, many of these controversies around COVID are not being more widely debated. So few academic conferences on the greatest global crisis since World War II, even though there are so many interesting issues and important issues concerning free speech and science and public debate and the performance of the media that need to be asked.
I'll just say on this that I don't think we have a great answer in the book as to why this happened. And in fact, our main goal in the book was just to describe, to tell the story, to get it down, sort of a first cut at history. But I was struck all through the pandemic by the lack of skepticism being applied to government policy in this area, where, as a political scientist, it's just typical that we ask questions about whether government policy is effective and whether it might have unanticipated consequences. Those are organizing questions for the field, and we tend to approach those types of questions carefully with a considerable degree of skepticism and great attention to measurement. And I was just mystified by the lack of publications comparing the response to the pandemic around the country and documenting the outcomes. So when Steve and I, wrote the chapter on the laboratories of democracy in the that appears as a chapter in our book, why aren't there many more publications along these lines in our journals? I know that other social scientists collected these data, and they're not terribly difficult data to collect. And yet there's just no writing on it. My suspicion is that this is a file drawer problem, that people run these analyses and they discover that there's a lack of association with the measures, and so then they regard it as there not being an interesting story to tell. But the reluctance and failure of the academy to sort of confront these obvious and important questions about government policy during the pandemic is really striking.
Agreed.
So I'm just trying to figure out where to go to next. Give me 1 second. What do you think this is going to do to long-term trust in the institutions, and how has it changed your trust in the institutions? I have to say that my political values today are roughly the same than they were 10 years ago, but the degree to which I trust the institutions of a state to be able to have an effective and rational response to a major crisis like a pandemic has suffered tremendously. And the institution to which I trust the consensus of experts has suffered tremendously, because we see, with example after example of the pandemic, that things which, certainly with the benefit of hindsight, and probably at the time, now appear to be based on erroneous evidence, appear to have come to the wrong conclusion, were celebrated as the one great wisdom of quote-unquote capital S science, in ways that, immediately has led to some lasting skepticism, which doesn't mean that I'm skeptical of a scientific method, which doesn't mean that I'm skeptical of the importance of studying things in an empirically rigorous way, as you indeed do in your book, but which does mean that, claims that something is based on the science, claims that some policy is needed because it is favored by so-called experts, seem to me to be much more dubious than my instinctive response would have told me 10 years ago.
Well, I would say I very much agree with what you just said. My confidence in liberalism and science has not been shaken, but I have found myself more skeptical and more disappointed, I guess I would put it that way, that on many matters, scientists and academics to some extent more generally, and journalists, are not willing to ask questions when the valence of the question and the possible answers are politically unwelcome. There's a very good article by Corey Clark et al. In the Proceedings of the National Academies of Science. I think it's fall of 2023 on pro-social motivations for bias in scientific work in general. And they find that things that we found elsewhere, that there's a kind of tendency to moralize scientific questions and to take one side and to be unwelcoming to hear people coming from another side because of what are seen to be, presumed to be, the political or the social or the kind of moral implications. And obviously we are concerned about the moral state of our society, but empirical evidence should proceed open-mindedly, and dissenters should be listened to, even when they seem to challenge, the partisan inflection of a position that we might prefer. So we have been very concerned about that. And another way to put it is we're publishing this book at a time when both science and universities are under considerable threat. Now even more so than just a few months ago. But I think our feeling is that the premise of those attacks is that these institutions are politicized, and the only way to show that's not true is by being willing to ask hard questions and being willing to pursue the answers where they lead. So our hope is that by pursuing these questions and trying to address them in a fair-minded, objective way, and taking seriously the arguments that were coming from the Republican side to a greater extent on some of these issues that might be associated with our political opponents, that might restore some measure of trust in universities and science and related disciplines.
I'll just echo your comments, Yascha, and say that my experience post-pandemic is similar to yours, that I find myself questioning anytime I read a claim in the newspaper or a news magazine that the science is settled on X or Y. I just don't trust those claims in the way that I did prior to the pandemic. I feel that I need to do more research on claims around climate change, that I don't trust in this quite the same way that I did. I know how scientific communities can circle the wagons and make certain types of questions unwelcome and disincentivize scholars from asking them. And I also know how newspapers and other outlets, news outlets, can maintain an editorial line so that obvious questions don't get asked. I mean, it was evident by the end of the summer in 2020 that the speed with which states had locked down had not made a difference in COVID outcomes. You could see that by that point. There was some research that would then get published in 2021, but it was already being written showing that. And yet no reporting on that, even though there had been you might recall, all those articles in the lead up to the lockdown saying that every day you wait with exponential spread will have all these dire effects, because models suggested that. Well, the models were oversimplifications of society, and one thing they didn't take into account at all is voluntary behavioral change. But be that as it may, like where was the revisiting of assumptions from back in the spring? There was just a complete shutdown of all those sorts of inquiries. The idea that that these measures might not have been effective, that keeping schools closed might not be making a difference, so what exactly is the evidence around population masking for control of the spread of a respiratory disease? Why were there not many articles on this in our major news outlets? And so the fact that I saw those kinds of groupthink dynamics unfold for years during the pandemic has left me feeling, very cautious about any kinds of claims about what science says for purposes of policy. I feel that it's necessary to go and do some study before I'm prepared to accept on faith any testimony from experts as reported in the news.
Which is genuinely sad. I mean, I think this is one of the areas of our society where sort of the failings of one institution, or to some extent one political side, then reinforce the failings of the other institution or the other political side. Clearly there were these pre-existing structural problems in the public health community, that it's far too hierarchical, that perhaps it's too driven by certain dubious ethical principles like the precautionary principle, that it's not actually open to genuine debate in a moment of emergency. That has then led to attacks on those institutions that are often exaggerated or misplaced, and now in the form of the Trump administration, it leads to just outright hostility to the great universities in this country and to institutions like the NIH. But that then in turn leads to rallying around, circling the wagon, to rallying around the flag, in which a lot of people in our kind of spaces are saying, no, we have to defend the NIH exactly as it is. We have to defend the universities exactly as they are. And I feel, even in these last few months, in my own academic circles, in my own more left of center circles, the space for criticisms of genuine failings of universities and more broadly the scientific communities closing down. And yet, when I speak to friends who are in the hard sciences, they certainly want the federal state to put a lot of money into scientific research, and they believe, I think rightly, that that is of great medium and long-term benefit to society. They're also deeply frustrated, even beyond these political issues, about how the NIH, gives grants based on, very small bore research that is often somewhat ideological, but even when it isn't, is just based on these sort of very small incremental steps in ways that really misshape the research agenda and make it really hard to do ambitious science, right? So what are some solutions here? Are there some ways in which we can reform the university, reform the public health institutions, reform the funding agencies like NIH to actually drive bigger positive impact in the long run and to avoid these kind of pitfalls?
Well, let me just make a couple of comments. I'm not an expert on the structure of the NIH. I do think you're right that there are many matters in universities and in science that are worthy of much more open discussion and debate, and that we need to have those discussions and have that debate and be much more open about criticism. I just think one fundamental thing is that I think we need to remember that the institutions of science and the academy depend upon certain basic values and value commitments on the part of the practitioners, and that includes I think scrupulous adherence to the scientific method, to following the evidence where it leads, and to being open to criticism. I mean, I have an article here from the Washington Post in December 2020 talking about John Ioannidis, researcher at Stanford, evidence-based researcher who was taking some unorthodox positions on COVID. And one of his own colleagues, talking to the Washington Post reporter, says about scientific debate that it's very important to have debates in science about and public health about things like the lockdowns and the closures and so on and so forth. But actually says, debates among scientists about the evidence is healthy, but if conducted in public, the rules change, says Goodman in this article. These debates can confuse people and undermine the consistent messaging needed for good public health. Politicians can misuse these debates to undermine public health, and so on and so forth. Well, we have to be more open to allowing these debates to break out in public, and not try to hide things from the public. One of the books that we found useful in thinking some of these issues through was Cicely LeBlanc's book on lying that came out in the 1980s, I think it was, and maybe been revised in the 1990s. And one of the things she finds is that educated elites, for quite some time have tended to be skeptical of the capacity of the public to understand the nuances of their debates, and therefore have a tendency to mislead systematically, in order to nudge the public in the right direction. Well, I think we're
so
past
there we
the
are
point.
back in the realm of a supposedly noble lie.
Exactly, exactly right. Or noble obfuscation. I mean, sometimes it's not outright lying; it's just not telling the whole truth or saying something misleading, or hiding the truth, as it were. But absolutely, some variation on those themes. And I think it's very, very destructive. People have ways of finding these things out. So Dr. Paul Offit at the University of Pennsylvania has written on some of these issues quite usefully. He was involved in the vaccine trials. And, with respect to the question of side effects for some small number of people, he makes the point, very strongly that, we need to engage in truth-telling with nuance. That the public will find out if it's being misled, people will resent being misled, and that will lead to terrific distrust. So I think there are many matters around COVID and controversies in universities in general on which we need much greater frankness and willingness to acknowledge disagreement, and to acknowledge past mistakes. I mean, I could mention one other issue, which is the origins of the virus. In February 2025, I have another article here from Nature magazine, not the scholarly journal, but the more public-facing magazine associated with Nature. And the title is "What Sparked the COVID Pandemic? Mounting Evidence Points to Raccoon Dogs." The article quotes 6 scientists, and 6 scientists only, and they're all strongly associated with one side of the debate, that the virus originated in nature, not in the lab. That's misrepresenting, I think, the actual merits of the discussion, because there's quite a lot of evidence for lab origin. And in fact, I would say the evidence is pretty overwhelming at this point, that the virus very likely originated in the lab. And it's just, these matters are not being openly discussed, a matter of great importance, because gain-of-function research is still going on. So it's not just a matter of looking back, it's also a matter of looking to the future. But we need much more open debate.
And certainly when it comes to gain-of-function research, beyond the debate about the origin of the virus, which I think is an important one, I've talked about it on the podcast before, and like you, I just note that a lot of serious scientists and a lot of agencies tasked with coming to assessments of this have concluded that it was an inadvertent lab leak. I don't claim to know the ultimate truth of this, and we may never know for sure which of the two it was, but at least we have to take that possibility very seriously. It seems to me that the whole framework that morally justified gain-of-function research has been pulverized by the pandemic. Because the idea, as I understand it, was, we know that there could be pandemics in the future. They are likely going to come from mutations of existing viruses in some kind of way. So what we're going to do is to manipulate these existing viruses in order to run tests on what kind of diseases might emerge. And that then allows us to prepare the vaccines, to prepare the public health response, to think through the kind of rational machinery that will kick into place in order to stop that virus from spreading, in order to be able to treat it better. Now, I think that in 2 ways, that has run aground. The first is that obviously the risks of conducting that gain-of-function research appear to be much, much stronger than we realize. That is certainly the case if it is in fact true that the gain-of-function research performed led to millions of deaths in form of a COVID pandemic. I mean, it is absolutely striking that one possibility here is that, yes, science gave us the amazing vaccines that allowed us to leave the pandemic, but perhaps science also created the pandemic in the first place. I mean, it would be one of the greatest failings, one of the biggest accidents of human history. Worse than the nuclear bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I mean, really, really a striking thing that I think we haven't quite grappled with. But the second is that there's this sort of underlying story here where, if some clever scientist figures out how a natural virus might next mutate, we're going to kick all of this rational machinery into gear to prepare the response for it. And given how disastrous our response has been, given that we didn't manage to contain the spread of COVID, given that we chose all of these public policies that were clearly misguided, I'm just very, very skeptical that gain-of-function research, even if it doesn't result in a lab leak, even if it does anticipate what the next virus might look like, is going to allow us to prepare that rational response. And that kind of means that the underlying justification for it is out of the window. So I'm very much not an expert on this topic, but it seems to me that we should be much, much, much more skeptical about doing gain-of-function research and probably constrain certainly the public funding we give for it. I mean, still today, our taxpayer money is helping to subsidize ongoing research like that might cause the next big pandemic, but perhaps even to go towards banning a lot of that kind of research. Do you have a stance on this, or?
Well, we don't go so far as to claim that we know how the virus originated. So we describe the story of the initial efforts to put a kibosh on discussion of a lab leak as a possibility, and then its suppression on social media as a topic. And we see it as symptomatic of the way COVID was handled more generally. That premature closure of debate, and so we see it as of a piece with the rest of the failings of the pandemic. We don't offer recommendations on how to handle this kind of research going forward. I would say in the area of epistemic democracy, which is mainly our focus, that I think that the failures of science journalism around the lab leak deserve close attention. That the tendency of science journalists is to go to scientists and sort of try to translate what they say for a lay audience, to sort of make their research and their findings understandable for a broad public. And so they are not inclined to question whether scientists have conflicts of interest, to treat them like the way they treat, say, people in political office when they make claims about X or Y, where you need to look behind that and see what's their self-interest. But in the case of the lab leak, they really needed to do that. They needed to be sensitive that virology as virology has self-interest on the line here. If they are responsible for a disaster of the scale of the COVID pandemic, then of course you can't just take them at face value that they've given a careful weighing to the various possibilities here, and that it's most likely from nature, and that they themselves had nothing to do with it. I mean, this needs to be viewed with a critical eye, and yet you still see articles that fail to to surface the conflicts of interest involved in this space. And so I think this highlights a kind of weakness around science journalism that's relevant to other debates where scientific recommendations and evidence play an outsized role.
And this is a broader frustration I have of journalists that the traditional ethos of a journalist was as a kind of somewhat working class sleuth who just is skeptical of everybody, right? Is skeptical of what those in power tell you, is skeptical of what every interview subject tells you. And it's not a cynicism that says that everybody is lying all of the time, but it's recognizing that your job is to recognize that people have interest in the world, that they construct the way they see the world in order to serve their interests, and that he shouldn't be taken in for a sucker. And too often now, journalists come in with either a strong ideology or a strong view of who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. And if you're talking to a public health expert or a climate scientist, they're the good guys and they must be right about everything. And manage they are good guys. I'm not saying that they have nefarious agendas or whatever, but they might be subject to groupthink. They might be very mindful of making sure that if they're a gain-of-function researcher, nothing threatens the future funding of that field. It's not that they want to destroy humanity, but like all human beings, they have their interests which shape their worldviews. I want to touch on one subject towards the end that I'm really concerned about, and that is what happens in the next pandemic. In some ways, and again, I don't want to downplay the gravity of a COVID pandemic, which cost a lot of lives, but in some ways we got lucky. We got lucky in that it impacted elderly people more than younger people. I mean, the premature death of an 80-year-old is a very, very sad thing, but the premature death of an 8-year-old is, in my estimation, an even worse thing. And secondly, the case fatality rate ended up being significantly lower than very early reports suggested it might be. It could have been that 5 or 10 times as many people would have died of this pandemic than actually happened. Now, the next virus may be more deadly for people across the age spectrum, and it may be more deadly overall. So it's very important for us to be prepared for it. It seems to me, however, that the pandemic has had two effects. One is to update my estimation of how good we are at dealing with pandemics. It turns out that the institutions we had that in 2019 looked like they were professional institutions that were very rigorous and thorough in how they go about things and have a lot of state capacity, a lot of capacity to respond to events, didn't have all of those things, right? We haven't even talked about failings like the CDC insisting on their own testing kits for the virus early on and how long it took to roll them out and how flawed they were and so on and so forth, right? There's a lot of reasons to think that these institutions just aren't as good at dealing with threats as I might have thought 6 years ago they would be. But secondly, it also seems to me that as a direct result of a pandemic, we're going to be much less able to mount a coherent response. The next time that public health authorities tell people, here's this virus, it's even more deadly than COVID, here's what we want you to do, and they might be right, given the best evidence at that time about what people should do, a lot of people very understandably are going to say, I don't know, you misled us the last time, you went right the last time, why should I trust you now? And so in an even more serious situation, even greater emergency, it will be even harder to have the kind of social coordination which might be necessary. So how worried should we be about the next pandemic, and what changes do we need to do now in order to have a somewhat better chance of dealing with it?
I think it's very difficult to know, but one of the things that shaped the last pandemic, as we've been discussing, is partisanship. And one would worry that depending on the party in power, depending on what looked like the election prospects and so on, that partisanship would shape the response once again. And I would hope that one of the things that some have learned is that journalists, academics, scientists, and so on need to not be sucked into that kind of partisan framing. I do think probably we've learned a bit about the costs of these measures that we've imposed, and I imagine that the public would be more skeptical if we were to have another pandemic about some of these lockdowns, at least in the near future. But I do think the partisanship is ongoing, and unless I think educated institutions, those who represent the independent, kind of truth-seeking institutions in our society, are willing to rise above partisan frames, then we'll be just as vulnerable as we were the last time.
I'll just say, as we look to the next pandemic and confront the two questions that you outlined, Yascha, that so how should we handle a pandemic? How could we do better in a technocratic sense? And then what do we do about the loss of trust in our scientific institutions? I think that the first thing we need to do is carefully study what happened this time. That we need to come to terms with this pandemic. That means, of course, a careful look at the evidence around what these measures yielded. Of course, we don't have randomized controlled trials, but there was variation around the world that can be studied, and then we need a careful look, without a thumb on the scale and without apology, at what was done, what worked, and what didn't work. So to answer the technocratic questions, it's amazing. Like the UK COVID inquiry isn't confronting that question at all, which is the most important question. They're asking all kinds of other questions, but not that one. A lot of questions having to do with the politics of the pandemic, but not the question of what worked and what didn't work. And then in terms of recovering trust, I think that can't be recovered unless there's a reckoning. I mean, among those who have lost trust, they need to hear that officials recognize the failures and that they understand. Now, of course, for those who haven't lost trust, well, fine. They continue to feel good about the whole thing. All right, that's good. We don't have to worry about them. They will listen next time, I assume. But what we see from public opinion, shifts in public opinion, is that there's been a great loss of trust. And so, how does that get recovered? Well, I think that the only way to recover it is to come to terms. And have an honest reckoning. And so our book is an effort in that vein, but it's just one effort, and it needs to be a lot more. And it can happen in society. It doesn't have to happen through some kind of 9/11 commission set up by Congress. It can happen in universities and and scholars and discussions like this one. That this is where shared understanding in society can begin to be reached as we look back at the pandemic, rather than just talking about the subjects that most appeal to people like ourselves, which is what we all tend to do in our fragmented media environment today.
Well, your book certainly isn't the final word on trying to figure out exactly what happened, but I do think that it is the first comprehensive, serious academic study of it. Thank you so much for that important book, and thank you so much for the time you spent with us today.
Thank you, Yascha. Thank you very much.
Thank you.